we're going to go live in just a minute, but I just, first of all, I want to thank everyone for moving into those conversations and for the leaders that stepped up to help make the conversations happen. As you can see from this design, we're trying to make sure that we deepen the conversations and really bring some specificity to the ideas that are on the table. So we appreciate that. And I just want to, before we start, just recognize the NEA design staff, Jason and Jenna and Jennifer. And also Nat Reed, who's in the back. They really took a lot of care in thinking about how to stage a conversation and how to put folks around the table. And Ned, yes, that's what I just said, and Ned. And so we're seeing the fruits of that as we are having a chance to engage in different ways. So what our plan is to invite reports back from the small groups, a similar format to presentation, except that they haven't had a plane ride to do this. So keep that in mind. I'm going to ask, and Amy has agreed that we're going to move backwards in order. So we're going to talk about events first, and then mission place, and then language. And we will again take the time to get a synopsis. I've asked everyone to really try to keep it to highlights, although we have captured the content by taking notes in the room and also on notepads. I want to remind you about the greenhouse, because we're now getting to that place where there's things that are going to fall out and not get onto the table sometimes. So remember that you can use your Post-its and put them up on the wall. And with that, Amy's looking like, okay, I could do this now. So our plan is, before lunch, to go through our report outs, have a little bit of conversation about them. We have a fairly restricted time. By 12:10, we're going to invite Michael and then Cookie Ruiz up to give us a few local snapshots of what work looks like on the ground, not always local. And then we'll get a break for lunch and can continue the conversation informally as well. So that is the plan. We're going live again, so our conversation is being heard, and I'll remind you to identify yourselves and all those important things. So Amy, please. You could, if you're more comfortable there, you can be there. So Amy's going to speak from her seat.
Hello, everyone. Amy Fitterer with Dance USA. So I was with the third group. The questions that we were tackling was events, how contemporary performance events transform and imbue lasting meaning and change within particular spaces and communities. How is it tied to broader social and environmental strategies? We were led by Howard Herring of the New World Symphony, and our group included Michael Orlov, Michael Rode, Jesse Rosen, Doug Sontag, Ashley Sparks, Noah Spiegel, and Sarah Wilkie. So right off from the beginning, under the first topic that I took notes on, further points to add to the summary. One of the first comments made was that the way this is framed is challenging. It makes it sound like the events are temporary, but really what we are always wanting is to frame placemaking around the relationships. Placemaking seems to be established when there is a much longer time frame in the making of the project, the relationships beforehand, during, and after. There was a question about, shouldn't this work always be tied to an organization's broader strategies in order to be authentic? There were comments about, could this work just be part of a larger area of work in how we engage our communities? Someone mentioned about trying to create a safe place to explore ideas that had to do with economic impact and tourism. And is that really what we're talking about now? And maybe, are we talking about engagement? We are trying to research our relevance to places and things. Again, trying to find a new forward-looking way into placemaking. And sometimes someone commented that thinking about our work in the terms of creative placemaking can be limiting because it can simply imply geographic boundaries. For points of agreement, disagreement, convergence, and divergence, we spent a lot of time stuck on the word temporary. What do we mean? Artists aren't temporary, but there are differing views that the actual experience might be temporary, but the experience starts beforehand and continues afterwards. Maybe this is all part of a continuum. Should we throw out the word temporary? Aren't all the performing arts ephemeral? What does temporary mean? Arts organizations that repeat programs on a consistent basis, is that temporary or permanent? We then got stuck briefly on the word transformation. That is still a word that resonates negatively with members of the group. We also spoke the word a lot of experience. Are we really just trying to engage around experience, both before, during, and after our activities? Also a reminder, we are not always talking about organizations. We are talking about project-based groups and independent artists, and we need to step out of our institutional mindset. So the more words that were brought up after temporary, transform, and experience were community engagement and community building, and again, relevance. The next item for questions that need to be asked or further explored. 1, can we articulate why this work is important? Where in the organization does this work reside? 2, can placemaking actually mean gentrification, intentionally and unintentionally? 3, can we control the lasting outcome of these community engagement events? And 4, can we get rid of the word temporary by replacing it with performances of varied presence and visibility, or development, implementation, and follow-up? No more temporary as much as the continuum. So then lastly, we were talking about some exemplary organizations, programs, or projects, a very wide variety of events, including the Holy Week in Spain that has endless arts festivities going on, HGOCO, Nashville Opera, On the Boards, Cornerstone Theater, Dance Place in Washington, D.C., and the one that I'm kind of excited about because it's not sitting at the table here is Woodstock, as far as a temporary, non-temporary cultural event that has had a lasting impact. So thank you so much to the team.
Thank you, Amy, and to the team. Anyone in that room, first of all, just there's something else that you absolutely need to add. That was such a great job. I really love the continuum of presence and visibility and understanding that as a frame. That really works. Right. Yeah, it really was a great job because I was in these conversations. So event, we came out of that room challenging the term temporary and a little bit the word transform and what that means. I would love to ask for just a touch of conversation around the negatives associated with transformation from that group. Thank you.
Well, I think it has to do with redevelopment of the urban landscape in terms of gentrification, of what happens in neighborhoods when artists move in and act as pioneers. Even if they serve that neighborhood, pretty soon those neighbors will be gone.
All right, great. I'm so glad I asked for the clarification because I wasn't sure if you were talking about that's not our ambition, transportation is not our thing, versus we're not trying to make a particular kind of thing happen. We're trying to do the opposite of that.
And we also talked about the complexity of transformation, who doing what to whom, and where that verb originates and where intention lives and its relationship to participants.
Great. And this is, Amy, maybe a little more negatively, but I also view that the word transformation implies a level of arrogance and that we should be entering into communities with a level of humility, and we should be so grateful to be the ones who are transformed.
Thank you. Great. Michael?
All what they said, but also transform, I think sometimes we just equate it to space, and we're also talking about people. And so it's not just the redevelopment, gentrification, all the other things that were said, but the transformation of perhaps individuals, groups, communities.
Thank you. Anything else that anyone else heard or want us to add to that conversation? And we'll have more time, but okay. All right, well, I'm going to invite MK then to keep us moving and to share a little bit about the highlights from Place and Mission.
Okay, so we were a little less following the protocol, so this will be a little more random in that, yes. So our discussion was around place and mission, and Sandra Bernard from the Houston Grand Opera led it, and Claudia Alick, Sandy Arnold, Jamie Bennett, Teresa Eyring, Dan Lurie, Cookie Ruiz, and Adam Skloot were the participants. And so we started off talking about the marginalization of work in organizations, of the broadly defined placemaking activities. For instance, starting as a grant-funded pilot and then not being integrated. And so we ended up with a lot of questions, actually. You know, how do you make the shift institutionally from something that is a project or a funded thing that goes beyond that limited funding, and which is a real challenge in the undercapitalized and overstressed arts sector. And does it go away after the grant? That brought up the issues of shared power and shared resources, which became a thread through what we talked about. And one specific focus of that shared resources was a conversation about artists and how are they at the table. And that was one of the questions that we ended up with, is what does it mean for artists to be at the table? And what are the examples of when artists are at the table? And the issue of artists' voice mediated through administrators as opposed to artists' voices directly. And so I think those are questions, as well as the compensation of artists and their sharing in the practical resources that are available in this context. Because many of these civic events or activities which include artists, the artists are doing it out of community commitment or love and are not necessarily being paid in the examples it came up with. And I think, Claudia, you brought up the Martin Luther King celebration in Ashland at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where a few administrators are paid, but generally speaking, the artists who activate the event are not. And so I think this whole issue is something that's important to bring up. The example of the Houston Opera in terms of the question they ask themselves, I'm shifting to a different point. If you are raising $21 million annually in a community, what is your civic responsibility as an entity? And so how can that organization have a better civic footprint and give back? And what, seeing themselves as a cultural resource, what does that mean? And so there were some tangible examples of the kinds of cultural resource that an opera company can be, including the craftsmen and the artists who work for the organization, as well as the things that they might have in a warehouse that could be accessible. And of course, the facilities is the other thing, which didn't come up, but certainly that's an example. We had a conversation about being allergic to the word outreach, which is, so maybe placemaking is an evolution of outreach in many institutions. And so the conversation circled around how are you collaborating? And the question that we asked there is, what is a healthy collaborative relationship? And I think that is really one of those defining things that needs to be approached. Conversations about the topic, is this embedded in the mission? And generally not embedded in mission, but embedded in values. And that's where it speaks within an institution, is in the values that an institution evaluates. We had a little conversation about the relationship of social media and the digital world relating to the live performance experience. And we didn't go into that a lot, but I think that is an important aspect of this in terms of community. And then I think the final conversation that I wanted to highlight is we talked about definitions of communities, and Jamie brought up the point that the Art Place program is about geography, but we highlighted that community is much more than just geography. And I quoted the Roots mission statement of communities of place, tradition, and spirit. And that placemaking can happen not just in geography, but can be about how communities are built, communities of identity, communities of ideas, communities of activism, and that's a better focus. So I think that's, we talked a little bit about the communities to which we are already connected, as well as those which we want or should be connected to. And particularly in the conversation about communities of tradition, culturally specific work or work from communities that are not part of the dominant cultural matrix. So, anybody want to add anything?
That's a lot of summarizing. Thank you so much. These were meaty conversations. You guys got right into it, which is incredibly helpful. One of the things that really emerged for me as I was listening here and in visiting the other rooms, and a comment that Howard made in a different room, is that we are actually getting at the economics and the distribution of resources in this work, which wasn't in any place an explicit question, but it ends up coming up in terms of when when transformation of place is successful and investment is changing in a city, is that distributing back into the cultural assets and resources? We're talking about the role of artists and their compensation, and the notion of administrators between artists and direct participation. So there's a lot about the economics that are coming up that I'm really glad to put some punctuation around, as well as this notion of talking not only about mission but about values, and the fact that values might be even more at the core in some cases than a stated mission statements in a mission statement. Other things that come up for you in this conversation around place or mission?
So
Sandy.
I'm Sandy Arnold with Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and it's just striking me, not necessarily in just this conversation, but we're very centered on words, right, and language. So our group had a very fruitful discussion about what community means. In the previous group, they were talking about what event means and what temporary means, and we're talking about what transformation means, and I think that's really wonderful. I also wonder if some of these words could be over-defined, and if we need to keep some flexibility in what they mean and what the balance between that is. And also, in coming up with definitions for all of these words, it would be really wonderful to have the people that we're working with in community help us with these definitions and finding a process for that.
Alienating. So those are challenges as well that were noticed there. Teresa.
This is it's Teresa from TCG. In the discussion about artists and compensation and participating in different kinds of events or initiatives or placemaking activities, one of the things I think it's really important to keep in mind, and it gets forgotten sometimes, that often people who are doing the organizing are, related to Claudia's point, they're on full-time salaries for their organization. Artists are often freelance, or they make their living through project-based things. So a lot of times, it's not that they're volunteering to volunteer. It's that they're being asked to do something, and the person who's doing the asking isn't thinking about the fact that they actually are being compensated because they're. Does that make sense? I think it's just a question to ask to make sure that there's an equitable approach to what's being put into a community, a placemaking.
Okay, thank you. It's good. I can be heard out there is what I want to tell you, so worry not. Okay, we're going to move to the last report to keep ourselves on schedule, and that's going to be Mitch. Are you going to come up or stay right where we are? Where do we like? Okay, we're talking about language.
All right, this is Mitch Menchaca with Chorus America, and I had Susan Feder, Mario Garcia-Durham, Jason Schupak, Mark Skorka, Carlton Turner, and Sisto Wagan. And it was a lively discussion of 6 pages of notes. And Colleen Jennings-Rogenzak, I'm sorry, who led our conversation. We had a great discussion on language, and I hope my colleagues will chime in after this, because trying to make this all into 1 page of notes is a little difficult than not sitting on a plane. The overarching aspect was about authenticity, and what does that mean? It requires reciprocity, listening, especially when working with communities. You have to choose language carefully, and I think there is that thing about flexibility in language. When we talked about creative placemaking, we decided that we can't really change the name right now. There's too many followers with this work that is happening. It's become a movement. But it does need a definition, it needs outcomes, and it needs examples, and simple examples that people can use when working in their communities. Funders have a responsibility for the authenticity, as they have been the drivers of creative placemaking. It was a really focused area of work around civic design and urban planning, and now has become very broad. And trying to figure out what fits under that umbrella beyond its inception is something that needs to be worked at. Talked about who is this language for, and is there different language for the different peoples or publics that are utilizing this. And the other thing that was not really mentioned, but I wrote it since I'm the reporter, is that I keep hearing the word urban in this, and what about the rural components to this work? We don't care what it's called, as long as there's goals. And if we are doing this work, how does it fit into our mission? And if it is in our mission, is it really embedded throughout, or is it just an education program that's trying to wade itself through? When we talked about some projects, Mark brought up a really good point about when doing community engagement or creative placemaking, is it what's being presented on the stage? A lot of his opera companies during this Halloween time use their makeup departments to, get kids all duded up for Halloween and really have an experience. It had nothing to do with any opera that was being performed on the stage. Gamage and the Dance Theater of Harlem, it was a really good means to teach kids about ballet, but not in any kind of participation barrier that they may have of just bringing maybe in a traditional ballet company, and that cultural participation is really throughout and not outreach or education, although I don't know why outreach became a dirty word. So it really was about authenticity. Some of the questions that we have, again, are the definition of what community is, and where does the social justice aspect play into this? We talk a lot about economics and community development, which also relates to economic impact, but where is that social justice aspect? And I open it up to my colleagues if I missed anything.
I would just add, we also closed with a conversation Sixto began with about the academy and the role of the academy, both in social justice. And I added the role of the academy as we were training artists to go out into the world.
I want to remark on something that Mario said, which is even as we deconstruct the creative assets that an opera company may have in order to deliver community services, we should not ask organizations to twist themselves into pretzels. They should still produce what they really produce and believe in the value, the community asset of that art form as well.
I'll just add, we did have a conversation too about the historic disinvestment in many of the organizations that do this work naturally as part of their work, and that I think that'll come in as part of our afternoon conversation, but we started talking about that already.
This is Colleen. I just have one more comment. We continually hear from all of us, but particularly in our session, who's not at this table. And I think we cannot forget that try to remember how to get those voices at the table, because we're actually representing a lot of voices that are not our own.
This is Adam Sklut with Ballet West. As someone who's new to the phrase creative placemaking, I'm beginning to get a greater clarity of what it means, but I'm still not quite sure in what context we're using the word authentic or authenticity, and I'm wondering if anyone can help clarify that for me.
You who are calling out the language and the terms, a couple of comments around that?
Sure. Well, we talked about authenticity being a process of call and response. And the question becomes who's making the call and then who's responding. If that call and response process is only happening within the institution that's doing the project or doing the work, then it's not authentic. And if it's only happening in one space, it's not authentic. It has to be a call and response that is happening between two entities that are engaging in a process together. And then once the work begins to happen, then understanding where the power and equity, how they relate into that. One of the things that we talked about was the institutions being open and accessible for change. So whatever it is that you think you're doing, or you're going into a community to do work, that idea is shifted by the people that you're working with.
what Mark's been trying to express, that the institutions need to really be authentic in bringing what they can. Otherwise, their work becomes the other stage, the community arts program. So authentic means we produce great opera and we bring all the values of great opera into the work we're doing in community. It's not a separate. So I think authenticity is in around the relationships, but it is also around the reality of what presence literally as an institution or an artist you bring forward. And so being something else when you're doing this work is not a good idea. It's really that thing. A lot of nods and good. Makes it Susan.
Susan Fader. Another language term we tossed around briefly was ancillary, and the acknowledgement that we don't want to devalue events that are not the main stage events. That all the contextualization comes from a very open and welcome place, and that it needs to be elevated.
That's great. There were a couple comments. I'm just going to go down this side of the table. Sandra.
Hi, this is Sandra Bernhardt from Houston Grand Opera. I just wanted to articulate what we mean by outreach. We've banned the word just because it traditionally in opera companies has meant going out to the community and saying, this is Bohème, it's excellent, this is why you should like it. And that is not a reciprocal collaborative partnership.
I guess one of the other things about authenticity was brought up is where are the resources and making sure that the budget is actually behind those values as well.
That's important. Thank you. Other comments then on this issue of language. I was in the room long enough to hear the challenge to agencies that are supporting work under the name Creative Placemaking, that the act of a lot of foundations coming together, the establishment of a program in a federal agency, has reverberating effects. And so some of the concern and caution around an urge to really expand our way of being able to think and see and understand the role of all the arts in creative placemaking is to get past some of the earlier more fixed kind of place definitions that might have existed. Because agencies have the power to create policy in places that they don't control. And so that came up. So it's a great moment for us to say that you've actually seen in reality the intention of the National Endowment and Art Place to be participants in this table and in this conversation, and that it is a conversation, it's not a policy discussion. And yet, we can certainly hear and note and take note of those things which need to be a part of policy conversations in all of our spheres as we go forward, service organizations and everywhere else. So I thank you for being willing to get there, and just as long as we realize it's not our purpose today, it's great. Thank you. We have just like a couple of minutes for a few other reflections, comments about these conversations. And I'll remind you that we're actually going to have individual conversations through lunch and then come back to this conversation. We're not going to leave this quite yet before we get into the hows and whys in the afternoon. So great reporting and good conversations. I really appreciate MK and Amy and Mitch for stepping up, and our leaders, Colleen and Howard, and where am I looking for you? Sandra. It's going to happen all day. No. For leading. We're going to do 2 snapshots now. Before we head off to lunch, just let's put some work on the ground in front of us. And so we're going to ask Michael, who got here, to talk with us about the Center for Performance and Civic Practice. And then Cookie will follow suit and talk us a little bit more through the story of Ballet Austin. And I think we won't be able to take much in the way of comment. We're just going to do our 2 presentations, if that's okay. If you want to be here, just let me know, and I'm happy to
I think I'm fine here, yeah? I'm fine, yeah. Yeah. I guess I need a clicker.
You have it, because I have one.
Thank you so much. Let me make sure I understand the clicker. I'm so sorry I was late. I woke up with a huge allergic reaction and spent your intros in the hospital getting steroided up, so sorry about that. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'll start. Jenny Hahn is a theater and film artist in Maine. Stephanie Gilbert works for the Maine Department of Agriculture. They met several years ago through a theater project Jenny put together working with farmers around the state of Maine. Stephanie helped Jenny connect with people who became research resources and access points to audiences who cared about the issues Jenny cared about. They both thought their relationship might yield a deeper collaboration, but did not have the time or resources to commit to the exploration. Jenny and Stephanie became one of 5 project teams across the country curated into the Catalyst Initiative. Catalyst offered them resources, coaching, and dedicated time to meet other teams from around the U.S. Jenny and Stephanie created a storytelling and creative practice process they have been using now as a convening structure for farmers, policymakers, farm workers, and landowners in rural Maine. Their work together has had a measured impact, and it continues. We're working with them on an extensive online portfolio and evaluation documentation piece. The Catalyst Initiative is a program of the Center for Performance and Civic Practice, a 3-year-old field-building resource that aims to make visible the power of the arts to demonstrably increase civic capacity. CPCP collaborates with artists, community members, and community municipal organizations to develop best practice frameworks for innovative engagement and cross-sector partnerships. CPCP defines civic practice as arts-engaged partnership work that is developed in service to the needs of the non-arts partner. The pilot round of Catalyst Initiative is supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation and also includes project teams in Louisiana, California, Kentucky, and Arizona. Round 2, also supported by Mellon, this time with a cohort of 8 teams across the country, begins in the spring. 15 years ago, I founded Sojourn Theater, an ensemble-based company that works around the country, creating original work, often in collaboration with community and non-arts partners throughout our process of development, production, and engagement. 3 years ago, I founded Center for Performance and Civic Practice. We go by CPCP. Today, I'm talking mostly about CPCP, but with both organizations, we engage with the frame of creative placemaking as a practice of arts-based partnership work in community with the purpose of bringing artist assets into dialogue and action around issues of place, public good, equity, coalition building, problem solving, access, and opportunity. Another CPCP program, Looking Glass Theater, is a nationally renowned ensemble-based theater company on the Magnificent Mile in downtown Chicago. Communities in Schools of Chicago is a nonprofit organization serving Chicago public school students and their families by bringing in services that are often outside the scope of what Chicago Public Schools has the resources to provide. Annie Razak runs Communities in Schools, and when we met, she described a need her organization could not fill in the public schools with CPS students. Around that time with CPCP, I started the Civic Practice Lab at Looking Glass Theater almost 18 months ago. It's a 3-year program supported by the Doris Duke Building Demand Initiative. Looking Glass and I made the case to Doris Duke that placing an artist's assets in service to communities' self-defined needs was not just social service, but a way for arts organizations that live in buildings to act as more than sites of presentation. By inviting those organizations in buildings into a different kind of dialogue with community partners, they can be perceived and actually function as hubs of cultural resources, assets, and useful dynamic partners. Annie Razak told me that the schools she works with don't have access to the level of trauma counseling they need in Chicago, that the public schools she works with don't have access to the trauma counseling that their students need on a day-to-day basis. And CISC, Annie's organization, doesn't have community-specific experiential opportunities for learning that they can offer faculty, staff, and students to meet this ever-growing need. Schools are asking for this every week. Andy White and Anthony Fleming, both Looking Glass Theater artists, and I began to meet with and lead workshops for faculty and staff at Crown Academy, a school on the inner Southwest Side. We have all together developed a plan to co-create with Crown middle school students, 7th graders, and Chicago mental health professionals, a workshop on mental health issues for the students at this school. Our goal is to create a theater-based public schools all over Chicago that Annie's organization will host and support. Now, Andy, Anthony, and I are not mental health experts, but as artists, we hold some expertise in process, in collaboration, and in making that leverages who is in the room towards problem solving and new ideas. Other current Civic Practice Lab partners include Chicago Parks District and Working Women's History Project and Roosevelt University. Catalyst Initiative, the first program I described, looks at smaller scale projects. Looking Glass's Civic Practice Lab, also a project of CPCP, looks at larger institutional partners and larger system interventions through artistic practice and process. Through these programs and others, we focus on capacities at CPCP that we have learned are of use to artists and community partners engaged in collaborative cross-field practice. Here's the end. We work to expand the conceptual palette of potential arts-based interventions and activities. We work to build tools for cross-field translation and co-design practice. We mentor partnership practice, and we advocate for the value of this work to community and municipal entities, leaders, and funders. Local arts and civic ecologies are the landscape we seek to impact. Workshops, mentorships, public conversations, site visits, online resources, and evaluations are some of the tools we're developing in collaboration with community and that we're using. Thank you.
I'm also going to make the note, for those of you who are meeting or hearing about the center for the first time, Michael does a lot of blogging in many places, but much of it gets to HowlAround, where Vijay is also based. And so it's a great source if you want to find more of it in addition to his own website. And with that, Cookie, there you are. Good for you.
So yet another starting place and yet another example. And this particular example starts from a place of artistic inquiry. So in the aftermath of 9/11, Valley Austin's artistic director, Stephen Mills, came to the realization that he was ready to have a deeper conversation with his audience. And what followed was the development of Light, the Holocaust and Humanity Project, which is defined as a contemporary dance work that is preceded in each city with a 3-month-long, multidisciplinary, collaborative, community-wide conversation on the topic of the importance of the protection of human rights against bigotry and hate. At the centerpiece of this project is this woman. She's 94 years old. She's a resident of Houston, Texas. Her name is Naomi Warren. She is a survivor of 3 camps, including Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen, from which she was eventually liberated. Through Stephen's amazing relationship with this woman, through his extensive study of the Holocaust as a non-Jewish individual, traveled to 8 death camps, including those in Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, and then eventually 3 different visits to Israel. Stephen decided to create a project of which dance would be but one part. So how do we get started? The topic was one that I think at some point where he felt the need as an artist to have this deeper conversation, he waited for the topic to find him, and I think he evaded the conversation for a while, and it was relentless. So after about 2 years, and then the beginning of his deep exploration, and then eventually our entire staffs went through a year of Holocaust education, eventually our board. Then we began to say, where will our partners be, and how do we even begin a conversation? Will anyone even be interested and want to come to the table with this conversation? So these are the 3 questions. How are the issues of the Holocaust relevant in our community today, which we believe we haven't learned the lessons? And then number 2, what is our responsibility when confronted with acts of bigotry and hate? And then number 3, what actions can we take to promote understanding in our community? So these 3 questions began the conversations. So from that point, then we began to think about leadership and how we knew that we believed that change would come from the grassroots, that a lot of organizational change at the top had not been happening, and maybe there was systemically some reason that those changes would never occur. But we do believe in the power of community and each of the members of those communities. But we also knew that in order for any sort of conversation to be meaningful, we also had to bring to the table individuals who have the potential to listen and to be involved and engaged and perhaps to create change. So ultimately, the national chair became Abe Foxman, the ADL national director. The USHMM, obviously we needed a very strong partner in terms of this topic, so that became our partner nationally. And then in terms of our community, we went to what became our mayor, the superintendent of schools, and also the police department. And these individuals represent a diversity also in race and ethnicity as well. And so then what happened next is how do you then, we're interested in this, is anyone else interested in this? Many people were, but what shape would that take? So there were three, we went into our community and held 3 large organizational meetings, and they were opt-out. In other words, everyone's invited. We went as widely with our list as we could. Everything said, if there's anyone not on this list and you know another individual should be at the table, invite them, send this on. There was a public meeting held in the area of education. One was held within the area of the arts, and one was held within our civic communities, those involved, engaged in human rights and also civic rights. And so in terms of those 3 meetings, we talked about how might this work, what would be the purpose of the conversation, how they would be involved. That was a very evolving thing because we really honestly didn't have the answer to that in the beginning. These lead partners were organizations of a size that, because we weren't asking for money and we weren't giving any money, this was a co-collaboration, co-promotion, co-sharing of information and co-branding, I guess, of that word, so that everything that would happen within each of our organizations would happen together. We did have these lead organizations, but ultimately what happened in our community that was so important to us and now in other communities was just a very broad range of logos and brands that had never worked together, organizations that had never had an opportunity to come together. And so that became for us really important. So the community partnerships themselves, we ended up with about 50 partners from our community. So what happened next was that these groups then, because we were asking people not to move beyond mission scope, not to suggest a project that they didn't have, not to go outside of their budget in terms of funding that they didn't have. And so the groups themselves began to define what the project components would be. And then for me, it feels I want to do as much service as I can to what these incredible organizations came up with. So the public lecture series had many different partners, but James Young is on this is James Young, if you all may know. So one of the people that was on the 9/11 committee is really an expert in representation, which is a very interesting, we're very interested in representation. And then I don't think this man, I hope Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate, needs no introduction. But hearing him speak to 3,000 students is an experience I will never forget. And then community dialogue. Initially, when this project came to be, the community dialogue in Austin, Texas was a really tough one. The issue that our community decided that was going to be the centerpiece of this was one that was focused around what was happening within our community. So there was a widely perceived use of excessive force against our African American community by members of our police department. So that was really the initial dialogue. And so this particular civic dialogue, the pointer's not working on here, but the gentleman standing is the editor-in-chief of the Austin American Statesman, the gentleman speaking is the mayor, and then others are elected officials. And it was quite a dialogue. You can see Stephen Mills behind the woman that's speaking, by bringing all parts of our community together. All is a big word, but representative parts that we're able to cram into the room, but a series of dialogues on a very, very difficult topic. And then when in 2012, when the project returned, by that time, interestingly enough, and I call it whatever one wants to call it, evolution, progress. By this time, the chief of police became one of the chairs of Light. And by this time, Austin had a hate crimes task force, of which we are a part, and our Light colleagues are all part of the hate crimes task force. We had not existed before. And then the Civic Summit, the hate crime task force over a period of time is now one of the sponsors of these various civic summits and dialogues. There was a visual art component. We wanted something free of charge, open. We wanted something disruptive visually to the community, that someone could not cross a bridge in Austin, Texas and not know something was happening. And so we found out about this wonderful visual art. It is 40 billboards that come from Jerusalem on the topic of coexistence. This became the backdrop of South by Southwest and stayed as an installation for a month. We had about 150,000 people. They're very ambiguous and interesting, and it's commercial arts. It's billboards. So that became a very important. I'm getting like the high sign to keep going. There was a KLRU PBS did a documentary on the making of the dance work that went on to win an Emmy. There was a digital component, and I'll go on and on. So the education component went into our schools, and then I am going to just click through and show you some of the different things that went on through all these great organizations. This particular literary group embedded writers inside middle schools and all the way down to 4th grade, and then did a concert with that. We had a choral group show up and overlay with this. And so I'll just flip through and you can see some of the things that happened within the community that ultimately ended up in the dance work. And I will let you go with that. I guess the closing piece of that is, since this time, the work has now been to 9 cities, including Austin, Pittsburgh, Miami, Denver, Akko, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem. We are with 4 other cities that are now requesting dates. In each city, the project is simply a platform for that city's conversation. There's nothing directive about it other than that there be a conversation held. So the work for us has been transformational. I know that we're not using that word, but in my life it has been transformational, so I will say that. But anyway,
the work is exquisite dance. And I just don't want to let Cookie sit down without you knowing that the work is exquisite, beautiful dance. The lighting, the costumes, everything about it. And one of the things that I love in the story is Stephen's discussion of bringing the dancers into the intention of the project itself, and their participation in beginning to understand the story that they were telling through dance, and their participation in the community dialogue and so on. There's so much that's moving. We first presented this story soon after it was happening at Americans for the Arts conference in Austin, Texas. And Michael's work, if you're 14 years old as Sojourn Theater, then you were about a year old when Sojourn was a part of the Animating Democracy Project for a big project in Lima, Ohio. And so I'll just take the note that with Ford Foundation resources, our exploration at Americans for the Arts was around arts and civic dialogue and arts and civic engagement. And we were connecting not only within the performing arts, but visual arts organizations, again, institutions, some of the seminal practitioners in this work and folks who were devising new ways to do it. And one of the things that I really want to point out in these 2 stories is the ways that as practitioners, you're finding ways to share the practice of the work as well as the stories and the outcomes and the demonstration of it. And I think that that is a big issue on our table in terms of capacity building, is that in both cases, the connection, you're finding ways to bring the work of how to do the work, and yet leaving room for people to make their own mark on it as well. So that brings us to lunch. Thank you both very much for those.